Welcome to Going Green podcast. We're looking today at a little question about, do climate protests really work? There's been a lot in the last few weeks around here about Insulate Britain. They've been trying to block motorways, and we've had Extinction Rebellion also going on about various things that they're doing to try and raise awareness, or could be cause disruption. So I'm Philip, and this here is Paul, and we're going to, over the next sort of 30 minutes, look at this in a bit more detail and see if these climate protests do really work. So let's ask you a simple question then, Paul. What do you think? Do you think these climate protests really work?
Well, it's the problem is you now got to define what do you mean by work. What you've got to look at, what is their goals? What is the goals of these protests or marches, or what are they trying to achieve?
Well, I'd like to say I think what they're trying to achieve is to raise awareness and to try and get governments to do something to try and improve our current conditions, so we can effectively save the planet. We can start getting this CO2 levels down, although they may not be the major problem, and see if we can sort of move to a better future. So the young students that I talk to are all feeling a little bit hopeless and saying, well, I can't do anything. You're just leaving this world in a right state for me to live in, and I don't know what to do.
I agree with that. It was one of those things where, looking into this before we started, I found that if a individual lives for 70 years, right, lives on a zero emission lifestyle. Anyway, the individual does not emit any CO2 for the whole of his 70 years.
Yeah.
Right. He would have not increased CO2 emissions by their total for a total of 1 second. 1 whole second. He's managed over 70 years. He's managed to reduce the emissions of the global emission pool, if that makes sense, only prevent an extra second of emission total to be released.
Okay, but let's say the world has got several billion people. If I can do that with several billion people, that's several billion seconds.
I agree that is absolutely true. Unfortunately, that actually doesn't equate quite to how you think it's several million seconds. It still managed to probably get to up to 7 minutes worth of emissions, which doesn't really help. Yes, you've managed to stop 7 minutes worth of emissions happening, but that's for over a person's life over 70 years, which I'm not saying is unattainable, but it's not something everybody can do over their lifestyle.
So what would you suggest that these protesters are doing, and how they can sort of do this? I know in America they've got climate strike as well, and we've had Greta Thunberg having a go at trying to get all the kids going on strike, and now she's going out this week. She was blaming Britain for the Industrial Revolution. If we hadn't started this Industrial Revolution, we wouldn't have this problem, so it's totally our fault. Sounds good to me, except, of course, without probably the Industrial Revolution, she might not have had the ability to stand up and say those very things, because the Industrial Revolution has what's revolutioned the whole world. The whole world has been revolutionized by the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah,
it's changed.
Yeah, it's one of those things where the reason it's called the Industrial Revolution as opposed to normal progress is because not that it was revolutionary in its thinking, but it revolutionized society, industry. It changed everything. You know, from the clothes we wear to the things we make. You know, it's you couldn't not live today without the Industrial Revolution happening. So, yes, I agree that we started the Industrial Revolution. But what about the Industrial Revolution happening in France, in Germany? I would say Spain, but I don't actually think Spain went through much industrial.
It did.
I know it did, but yeah. But it's more sort of you looking at where the economic powerhouses when the Industrial Revolution was happening. And the honest answer is, where would we be without that? And the honest answer is we'd probably be, well, stuck. Because, of course, we wouldn't have that many people. It'd be more, yes, it'd be more sustainable, nicer. But as you say, Greta Thunberg wouldn't be able to stand up and say all the things. How about this? How about modern medicine? Without Industrial Revolution, modern medicine wouldn't have appeared. So, you know, you look at those sorts of things and go, was it such a bad idea? Yeah. And I understand the point was, technically, yes, it was bad. But at the same time, it was also very good. So you can't just blame it directly on that. So you can just blame it on, we didn't know at the time of the Industrial Revolution what we were doing. And it's the same now, because, of course, let's say, we've got lots of ideas about climate change and how we can prevent it and all sorts of things ready. So let's investigate one. Oh, by the way, we're all dead because of the climate change. So we can't investigate, not in climate change, but ways of reducing climate change. Because, of course, by the time we've got the results, the studies, the things, we're dead because of climate change. So you've got to look at sort of...
But it's time. You're also talking about time there.
Yeah, well, yes. Yes, it is.
It's going to be 1,000 years.
Well, yes. I'm not saying that at all. But it's more in regards to the fact that we can't sort of experiment with ways. We have to implement the ways. So we've got to find out what's the best way whilst implementing that way.
Well, climate change has only really been really obvious in the last sort of 20 years. When I grew up as a child, and I'm not telling you how many years ago that was, climate change wasn't on the agenda. But there were things on the agenda, like the Clean Air Act, that there was all the smog in London just before I was born. And they brought in things like the Clean Air Act to try and make the place, London, sort of better to live in. Because, there was just so much sort of, smog, fog and smoke. And by cleaning that up, it did make a difference to the
public
environment.
Health. Yeah, and public health, more importantly. So you can see that, without change, things can't get better. But at the same time, where does change happen? It doesn't happen at the individual level. It happens at the broad level, the policy, the governments, the corporations, right? Okay.
And government.
I could say government.
All right.
Anyway, so the idea then you're asking, all right, these protesters, they're protesting to the government, to business, about they should be changing because they can do the change as opposed to we, the people. Right? And that's fair enough. That's no problem. But the major issue, of course, are they listening? Obviously, it's one of those things where if you go, say, to a round meeting with your politician and you raise those ideas, he's got to listen because he's the only one there. But if you're just moaning at the entire government all at once, you've lost that. You've lost that perspective of sort of trying to influence key officials or key people. We're talking major sort of policy decisions. You're not talking about the actual politicians, but people who make policy.
So let's look at one of those then. So these protesters around here, Insulate Britain, they've been occupying the motorways. They've been sitting down in the motorway. blocking that, stopping other people going to work. And there's been quite a lot of anger directed at these people. So who's getting affected? Who are they trying to sort of, well, change, I suppose? Who are they trying to sort of persuade?
So you've got to look at what the group stands for. In Insulate Britain stands for they want to have all Britain's homes insulated because, of course, that means we require less heat to heat them up because they're insulated much better. And that their objective is to get the government to insulate the entire UK homes. Okay, that seems a fair enough goal. That seems easy. That's no problem.
Yet the government actually does quite a lot of that already. You know, I know we got grants and free ones at that to get our house sort of.
They were doing the cavity wall.
We did. We had cavity wall done because we qualified, and we've put in stuff in our loft, and then we put more stuff in our loft, and we could still now put even more insulation in our loft.
Yeah. So, and see that's what one of the things with that those grants and things did happen. Unfortunately, you had to qualify for them, and I'm not saying qualifying is hard, but it's one of those things where you know they have to set sort of guidelines and things. And what really Insulate Britain should technically be asking for is either for that government program to run again, you know, to allow more people to qualify, or to change the qualifying terms so get more people who are able to qualify. So but that's not what their message has been.
No,
unfortunately not. Yeah, it's one of the things where they just want someone to do something, and that's fine. That's no problem.
see, I thought their message was, "Oh, we've blocked the motorway, so you can't go to work." I thought that was what their message was. Have I misinterpreted? Just because they blocked different bits of the motorway on different days, that's what they're trying to do, isn't it? To try and stop people going to work.
Well, I thought it was to decrease the emissions from cars with that stuff, because obviously, but unfortunately, a car standing still is still emitting not the same amount of emissions that a car,
but nearly the same.
But it's nearly the same because obviously, you know, the engine's still running, and so basically they haven't changed anything. They've just made a lot of motorists annoyed, and you know, and then they've made the got arrested and all sorts of things. But they say it's worth it, and the answer is it might be worth it to say you're doing something about it, but did you actually achieve anything?
So they're getting stuff in the press. They're on the news. You can see the pictures of them being dragged away. But have they achieved anything on their protest? And that's where we're both in sort of an agreement, I suppose, really. And the answer is we don't know. It's how many people get persuaded and what sort of people might get persuaded. Now, you were having a look at an academic paper, I think written in 2020, weren't you?
It was 2019.
Yeah, it was done.
It was done in 2019, published in 2020. So anyway, and they were looking at, unfortunately, it's all in America because at the time there was more American protests. You know, we're talking, they were referencing the future for Fridays for Future. So I'll get it right, which of course is the Greta Thunberg protest march event.
Yeah.
And they were basically asking protesters or people before and after the march and what happened. And basically, to summarize their report is basically, if you were, I say, conservative leaning, this is where obviously it's the American politics.
With a small c.
With a more small c. So you're more talking if you're right leaning, politically viewed, you were less inclined to join in. However, if you were left leaning, you were more inclined in. Now, this was actually only on the street. So would you be, as a bystander seeing the march, would you join in? That's their views. And we've also seen that the opposite effect happening, which is obviously if you're leaning, then you're less infused by these posts, thinking that they're not going to do anything. They're just a bunch of, unfortunately, lefties having a go. As opposed to if you're left wing, you're sort of, go on, show them who's their maker, and you're more inclined to not show sympathy, but to sort of empathize with their message.
But climate change isn't anything to do really with whether your politics are left wing or right wing.
Well, no, this is whether you've got the whole that we're all together as the as the problem goes. So you can't really say it's got nothing to do with me, because it's got all sorts of things to do with me. But the critical point where you take away is normal protests and strikes. Let's say you take a factory, the workers strike.
Yep.
And they got leverage because the factory's not working. Therefore, they've got leverage over the boss to increase their right pay, whatever they want to change. And that's where the agreement of the talks, and that's how unions form. That's what unions do, and there is a problem. However, the problem with, say, climate protests is, of course, it doesn't just affect the protesters. It doesn't affect the people who are there protesting it, but it affects the bystanders and the non-protesters equally, because obviously we're all in this together. And so the answer is, what leverage does climate protests have to govern or to influence the people who have the power and the decisions and all sorts of things? And it's sad thing to say is there isn't much leverage, because obviously, let's take the Insulate Britain, where they decided, block the motorway. All right. They're blocking the motorway. They're giving the motorway to shut, and therefore they'll say they'll stop, let the motorway go in regards to if the government do things.
But that doesn't happen because the police come along, they remove them off the motorway, they get charged, they get fined, and maybe they get imprisoned. And the only thing you've got is some message that they're called Insulate Britain, and people don't necessarily get the message. It's like this strike of school kids every Friday. What did it really achieve? It's got a little bit more awareness, but has it actually made any real significant difference?
And that's the hard thing to gain, because, of course, these kids did go on a strike. People saw they were on a strike. Schools were embarrassed that they were on a strike. But they didn't really do anything because they went on strike. They didn't find okay, so you went on strike because you're protesting this. So what can we do to keep you in school? And the answer is, well, they didn't do that because,
schools didn't change their carbon footprint. I know because I worked in a school that when they rebuilt it, they did try to do their best to try and reduce the carbon footprint a lot. They used recycled water. They used sort of passive heating systems. They used biomass, fuel, all to try and get it down a little bit. But it's only getting it down a little bit. And I know if everyone does a little bit, that's a lot. But there are some major players out there who are producing an awful lot of pollution, and targeting them would be a far more effective way. This week I've been looking at the fluorochlorocarbons used in refrigerants. And as a byproduct of making one of those, they made a different one. And these companies got paid to get rid of them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That meant that some companies just made these chemicals just to get rid of it. And they made billions, trying to do that. And really working on those companies to try and get rid of those things would have a greater effect. Now, you were talking to me earlier about how much CO2 a house produces compared with...
Oh, right. Yeah. So we'll start at the beginning of the picture because you skipped to the middle point.
I did, yes.
Yeah, right. The aviation industry, right, globally produces something like, I think it's 5 megatons of CO2 per year or somewhat. It's a relative figure in
A number, yeah.
a number, right? And we go, oh, that's a lot. Could we reduce that? That they've been working hard to reduce it, but we'll glance over that, right? You know what also or produces more CO2 emissions than the global aviation emissions? And the answer is it's household emissions, as in the gas boilers in everybody's homes. How much gas they produce is equivalent to the global households is equivalent to the global aviation industry. So is it right that the aviation industry, who have brought their CO2 thing down, and they've managed, they can't get any lower because obviously they're still burning fuel and we need the new fuel, but they've got them right all down to a good low number, and yet households are just going up and up and up because we're getting more houses.
And more people.
Yeah, this is the one of the major crux. So you sort of go, oh, right. So instead of tackling things that are being tackled and they're struggling hard to tackle to reduce more, why don't you tackle the bigger numbers, like the housing? So, then the next argument is concrete. Concrete is known to emit around about 8% of the total global emissions, right?
So that's for making buildings.
And all sorts of things. Yeah. Right. Okay. Let's say you remove concrete entirely, that 8% chunk, and you replace it with something like wood. Let's just wood in replacement would actually emit more carbon than the concrete. So technically, concrete is the low emission material.
Already, yeah. And we have another problem with things like, I don't know, let's put some asphalt on the road.
Yeah, this is the dregs of the barrel. This is really carbon intensive stuff. It's not nice.
All made from crude oil.
Made from crude oil, right? And obviously the industry. Except, of course, what else do we use asphalt for? And the only answer is we use it for roads because it's the right material. And when you lay your asphalt, how much CO2 is actually emitted from that from the asphalt?
Hardly any there.
Hardly any, because it's just a layer of carbon. So is it the asphalt? Is it emitting CO2? No, we're using it. And therefore...
And it was a byproduct of making petrol, diesel, fuel oil, all that lot.
So you can see now suddenly the asphalt is actually helping, I say the fuel industry, but the refineries, the oil industry, all those sorts of things, to actually be not necessarily carbon neutral, but definitely reduce their emissions because they're actually using all of the oil they extract rather than just having wastelands filled with asphalt that, can't do anything with. So they're being, and suddenly you see, so what this gives you is not the fact that the picture is sort of, all doom and gloom and sort of we need to change our ways, because of course some of the ways don't need changing. What does need to be changed is the fact that sort of the view of what's happening.
So we're trying to change. So are you thinking that these protests are raising awareness and they are getting some people maybe that wouldn't have otherwise to start thinking about these changes in lifestyle? I see these people. I saw an interview with some lady and she was doing one of these protests, and I thought, well, hang on a minute, let's just look at you for a minute. And she was saying we ought to cut down this, this and this. And she's wearing a very nice polyester dress, which is made from oil. And she was carrying her stuff in a plastic bag, and I'm thinking, well, where do some of these things start? And it is starting, not going out protesting, but it is actually starting at home, starting to do these things to try and get rid of the need. So if people stop wearing plastic clothes, things made like polyester, nylon, all the stuff made from oil,
the market might change
Yeah.
to produce less plastic coats because people are interested in plastic coats.
if I don't use any plastic bags, but instead I use stuff made of natural products, hemp or something, that's been gradually sort of absorbing the carbon dioxide out of the air in the plants. And that's a beneficial substance rather than my plastic bag, which isn't.
So one of the crucial things you find that changing people's attitude, but if you change people's attitudes, things also change. Would you like to know what has actually been a successful change in the world?
Yeah, go on, tell me.
Right? The program of, I think it was like the Blue Planet 2, very recent documentary, about the Blue Planet, right? From that, they were talking inside it all about the plastic, the microplastic and all those sorts of things, right? That program is not equated, but is estimated to get more people to reduce their, I wouldn't say plastic consumerism, but it's to reduce their plastic needs, or how much plastic they use, by almost 60%. So suddenly you find a program, a TV program, a documentary, all about nature and the animals, suddenly do more global change than
all the protests.
than all the protests combined. So is it better to do I say documentary, but is there something to do that to change people's minds rather than the protests at all?
So the protests haven't really, I don't think the protests have really got the right point, and I don't think they've probably got enough people going on that. But programs and other things certainly have. So should these protesters then think again and say that this strategy, it works well in a business against a business, but it doesn't work so well against the government? It's raised some awareness, but is there something better that they could do to try and raise more awareness and get people to do something? And it is actually making the change. It doesn't matter whether I'm interested in this or not. It's whether I'm doing something about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think on this, I'm going to stay on this note of sort of personal endeavor. If you want to do something, and you can use your wallet or your vote to influence people who are trying to do things, things might change, and hopefully things will change if we all collectively got together and use what leverage we have to change the world. We might get there.
So buy differently, think before you buy, and it might make a bit of difference. You've been listening to the Going Green podcast. We've been talking here about, do climate protests make a real difference? And our opinion is probably not as much as they would like. Thank you for watching, if you're watching on this on YouTube or listening on the podcast. And we'll talk to you next week on another subject on Going Green. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And a goodbye from me.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.